Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. I'll be your host, Jason Campbell, Business Development Leader here at Strategic Treasurer. And joining me today for this great discussion is our Senior Director, Paul Galloway. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jason. Looking forward to the conversation.
I'm always looking forward to anytime I get an opportunity to talk with you, Paul. Just like always, it's always a pleasure. Your wealth of knowledge is just, it's a blessing to be a part and associate with you in these podcasts. And hopefully for our listeners will feel the same as you continue to educate our wide audience here. So looking forward to this discussion. And really with this piece of what we're going to do today, I think it's extremely relevant. Obviously it's something that is top of mind for a lot of folks, especially as those who really monitor, government actions right now and what's happening in that financial world. And more importantly, really talking about the federal debt limit. I know there's, I've been watching and keeping track of it. I'm sure you have as well. And I'm sure many of our listeners have about, it's always, I don't want to say it's a fight, but it's always it's a give and take, right? It's one of those where it's a lot of negotiations go into this to ensure that we don't move into a default situation. And I think our listeners are really going to enjoy today's conversation about this topic here. So let's kick it off and get right into the meat of things. And let's talk about this federal debt limit. And Paul, if you just want to give us some context, some background for our listeners and just kind of give us your thoughts around the debt limit.
Yeah, sure, Jason. I think a lot of people are thinking about this, and if they aren't, they should be. It's certainly something that has been a problem in the past. It's not the first time we've had this pressure between two sides of political parties not agreeing on what a fiscally responsible debt limit is and what they should be doing. So you've got people on both sides of the aisle that have different ideas and thoughts on what a debt limit means and how they should spend money. And the way that our federal government is able to effectuate all the activity that occurs in the U.S., supporting programs, funding the government. That means all of our lawmakers, the people we elect in office, judges, our military, infrastructure, all these things that we do to help support our economy from a governmental standpoint come into play. And so politics have a direct impact on, what gets passed. And so we have President Biden and House Speaker McCarthy are meeting. They've had several meetings. They've had on and off conversations, either in person or otherwise, or with representatives on both sides to talk about the issues. And what it comes down to is people are elected into office to represent their states or the country as a whole, and they have certain political things that they have committed to. And so anytime you get into these kinds of conversations, they're trying to protect their constituents' desires, what it is that the majority wants out of their government. And so politics play into this big time. Now, question is, who funds this? Jason, I don't know if you've thought about that. Do you have any ideas on how does the federal government raise capital or raise money to spend? How do they do that? What are their options? And for many people, they may realize, well, we have an arm of the government, the Treasury, that can print money. We have the Federal Reserve that controls monetary policy within the U.S., and that can have an impact on money supply. But at the same time, there's also receipts that the government receives in the form of taxes on top of that. So there are revenue streams that the government receives as well. So it's not all just spend based on the federal debt limit. But the reality is that there's only so much that can go around, and you're trying to fund all these different programs and keep your government going at the pace that the American people expect. And so there can be differences in opinion or thought of how that should work. And I'll just pause and give you a second to kind of think about that and see if you have any additional questions in regards to, federal debt limit, because once we hit that limit, that means that the government has run out of access to cash via debt funding. Now, we have obligations because we have a significant amount of debt. The federal government has an amount of $31.4 trillion in debt today. Once we reach that limit, they will have expended all the amount of debt funding they can do, and they'll have to rely solely on the revenues that they have to fund all their obligations. And you can imagine on an amount of $31.4 trillion, there's quite a few interest payments as well as principal payments along the way for issuances that mature. So there's a lot of cash involved in that amount of debt.
We grow up and I remember always watching, that the ticker of national debts, and always seeing, especially when it's always like how you say, an election year, so to speak, right? And it's intriguing in understanding how it affects so many pieces of how our country operates and functions. As you mentioned, the military, federal agencies, even like it affects, government workers, period. So whether it's national parks, even from securing our borders, there's so many different pieces. Now, when you were mentioning kind of the politicians a little bit, I'm like, well, maybe sometimes it may not be a bad idea to reset them a little bit, but near here or there. But I guess the other thing to think about as well as, the things that shut down because of these things. And it's almost like, again, we're watching and we witness this. It seems like it happens every year, right? Like when we get to the budgeting and we get to the debt limits and the ceilings, it's not like it's magically just all of a sudden appears out of nowhere. We know that we're heading down this pathway. It's like witnessing a train collision. You know what's about to happen, right? And it's about having where, it's like it shouldn't be a fight. There should be a point where, like you said, doing what the vast majority, doing what's right by the constituents and things of that nature. And as I know that as far as how it impacts our individual local lives. But I'd like to take it a little step further, if you don't mind, and ask the question of, from a corporate treasury or just from a corporate, impact of this debt limit, can you just kind of give me just kind of your thoughts on what impacts this can relate to corporations? Like how does it impact those? I know, outside of just your normal civilian day-to-day life.
So when you think about the impacts of this to corporate treasurers today, or people that manage cash or companies' capital, I can think of corporations and government entities in the same way when it comes to the subject we're talking about today. Government has a mandated limit in terms of what they can borrow. The U.S. government also has a credit rating. The U.S. government also receives revenues. All this goes to fund everything that the federal government does. We think about corporations. Corporations can issue debt. Now, there are different types of corporations, and we've talked about this before, different types of capital raises that they can do. But let's just take larger U.S. corporations that have credit ratings by recognized rating agencies out there. And so your rating can have an impact on how much you have to pay for the debt that you borrow. It can also impact the amount that you may raise based on what the mix of your balance sheet looks like. So like the federal government, corporations have a certain amount or threshold of capital that they'll be able to raise via debt and an equity offering, but we're focused on debt here in this conversation. So there's only so much you can raise. Your equity holders aren't going to allow you to raise more than a certain amount. The markets aren't going to have an appetite to give you more than a certain amount. So there are limitations to the amount of capital that a corporation can raise. And so treasurers are trying to balance that and ensure that they optimize their balance sheets so that they can fund the operations of the company. So they have debt funding and they have revenues that fund the operations and growth of the company. At the end of the day, companies are there for profit. Now, government entities are not. It doesn't mean that a government entity can't run without a surplus, meaning that they are bringing in more than what they're spending. And we've had that in various times throughout history where the federal government earns more than what they spend and they have surplus. And there are times where they do the opposite. They spend more than what they bring in. And when they do that, it means that they're raising up towards the federal debt limit. And then we have these conversations that we're having today. So treasurers and corporations have to manage their capital just like the government has to do it. There's only so much you can do. At some point, you can't do anymore. So you have to take action to either generate more revenues or you have to take action to adjust your budgets and cut spending. That can have an impact on not only company when a treasurer's or CFO, companies managing their capital and cash, can have an impact on their organization. It can also have an impact at the federal level, which translates to impact on our economy. If we're not spending money and we're reducing the amount of spend, that can have a negative impact on the economy. So you want your government to continue to do things on a regular cadence, just like you want companies to continue to do things on a regular basis. So we get to this point where, from a government standpoint, we're hitting the debt limit and the conversation is around, well, we need to raise the limit. The question is there a certain point where you say enough's enough? And we got to deal with the debt that we have on the books. If you look over the recent decades, the amount of federal spending has increased significantly, and so has the amount of debt that we've taken on. I think that at some point, the American people are going to say, we've got to acknowledge the situation we're in, and we need to figure out a way to do that. There's going to be different thoughts around how you do that. Do you tax the American public more? Do you reduce your spending in the areas in terms of programs or other things that you're doing to support the American people? There are different approaches that you can take to get there. But at the end of the day, I think at some point we have to have one of those conversations where we figure out what the right balance is and how we fund the things that we need to fund to keep our country going, keep it safe, and satisfy the needs of the American people out there. And it goes the same way for a corporation that is competing against other companies that may have goods and services. They're trying to protect their customers and their clients. They're trying to keep their business going and keep it growing. And so it's really no different when you think of it in those terms, even though the purpose of the federal government and the purpose of a for-profit company is different.
Well, with 8 days remaining, I guess, until the quote unquote the hard deadline, right? So our elected officials have 8 days to figure this thing out. And it's funny, as you were talking about, the basic math. I mean, that's pretty. I'm not saying the concept is pretty simple, right? You got to find ways to either you raise the capital. I'll say raise capital to debt wise. You increase your revenues, right? And you got to cut spending somewhere in that piece. Something's got to give to take it out of the hole. And so as you were talking about raising capital and going back to that conversation around, how to do that. And I know you were talking about from a government perspective. So how much can we issue, right? So as we talk about, selling debts and things of that nature, how much can we afford? What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The spending bill that's forward right now, I believe, is $1.5 trillion. And so that gives you an idea of they want to raise the debt limit by $1.5 trillion. And right now, President Biden, his staff, and House Speaker McCarthy, and people on the Republican side are meeting to discuss, what does that look like? So what we know is right now, $1.5 trillion is the amount of additional debt they want to put on the books. Now, how much can we spend? Well, we could spend less than that. We could spend more than that. But as we keep adding on to the amount of debt that we have outstanding, that just means that we're going to continue to increase the amount of interest that we pay on a regular basis, as well as the outstanding principal that we have. It starts eating into the overall cash that you have available to fund programs to support the government and to support the American people for various different things that our government does out there. You can think of all kinds of different government agencies out there. They all serve a purpose to support our country and protect the people and help us prosper and have the kind of life that we have here. And so they can spend more than what that debt limit is. But if they do that, that means that we're going to be back to the table a lot sooner. And we keep adding more debt, we're going to have more obligation. So the point at which we can't withstand that anymore is something we want to try to avoid. At least in my opinion, we want to try to avoid that. Having these late day 11th hour conversations around raising the debt limit, it's an uncomfortable situation for everyone. Everybody is watching this from a financial standpoint. Markets are watching this. Companies are watching this. All of our government agencies are watching this. Our politicians are. A lot of people are focused on this. And it's not just in the U.S., it's around the world. The U.S. defaulting on its obligations is something that has always been never thought of in terms of it would be reality. But you sit here and you think about reality is I think it's a relatively low probability. But the reality is there's some level of probability that we might not reach agreement. Then the question is, how long does the Treasury have until it runs out of cash? And then what are our options to avoid default? So we kind of talked about some of these things. Raise the debt ceiling, the ability to control costs. So think about the Treasury. Treasury says, well, June 1, that's what Janet Yellen has put out there. It may be some days after June 1 in actuality, but, avoiding default if the debt ceiling doesn't get risen is the Treasury's ability to either generate cash or utilize cash efficiently that they have on hand. So to make it last longer. It's also the government's ability to spend less to fund things. So not just the Treasury, but our government agencies, the ability to push things out and not spend today, but spend tomorrow. So can they control some of their spending? Can they make it last longer? You may have heard some people talk about the president's ability to use the 14th Amendment. And I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to this legally, but that is a lever that's being contemplated out there. Will it be utilized? I think the probability of it being utilized is low, because I believe it's a higher probability that the debt ceiling will be raised. Another option, which Janet Yellen has called this a gimmick, but it's legitimately an option. The Treasury could mint a $1 trillion platinum coin. They could mint this, put it in a vault, and then use it to issue $1 trillion in debt. So that would be what backs the use of raising $1 trillion in cash. Now, do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't think that's going to happen either. Because again, I think we're going to come to some kind of agreement between now and June 1. And we're going to essentially, I like to call it, kick the can down the road, because that's what we're doing every time we come and we have these conversations and the debt limit gets raised, we kick the can down the road. At least that's the way I feel. I feel like we need to address some of these things a little bit better.
I think it's funny you use the kick the can, analogy there, and and you're right though. I mean, I think a lot of it is just like, hey, it's, are we looking for permanent solves? Because I think a lot of times it's like there's time to find the appropriate plan in today's world, right? With as smart as people are, and the technologies and the models and the forecasting and everything that we have in our universe, if we can send people to outer space, if we can cure diseases, we can do all these other things, but we can't figure out how to balance our stuff, right? Or how to figure out what's the long-term plan to resolve this, because obviously you can't just keep raising it. There's a limit for a reason, right? It's just almost like, come on, we got to get both sides of the aisle to cooperate and figure out that like there's truth in these statistics, right? Is what they say, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie, right? There's truth to how to a model out there that's got to say this is the path of righteousness to get there. It's just the mere fact of how to do it on the right angle, right? I mean, there's just got to be some form of relief down the road. You just can't keep getting down and say, hey, we'll deal with it in next terms. It'll be somebody else's problem. And it's no, the problem is now. And we got to figure out to ensure that, there's so much at stake and there's so much at risk from all angles, to protect, like you said, our credit ratings as a nation and how the world views us, but, and then within our nation, right? And then how it impacts the citizens and how it impacts corporations and day-to-day business needs and how transactions work and how it impacts markets, how it impacts investing, how it impacts security. There's so many different variables that go into this. But obviously, I got to believe there's a model out there that says, hey, we got all of it and here's the plan. It's just a mere fact of somebody willing to go forward with it. I mean, that's just what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, that's certainly a thought that I've had as well, Jason. There's a lot of smart people out there, and we've got some smart leaders. To government entities, there's a lot of politics involved in it, and that's what makes things much more challenging versus, hey, I'm a leader of a for-profit company. I have a board that I report to. I've provided my strategy to the board. The board's okayed it. I go out and deploy on that strategy. Now, I'm either going to remain in charge or not based on my performance. That's what happens for for-profit entities. And likewise, for the government, it's kind of similar because the politicians represent the people who elected them. And they're either going to, they've said, hey, here's what I'm going to do for you. And if they aren't able to do the things they committed to doing for the people that elected them, well, they won't get reelected. So that's their board. The board is the people. Each individual in the U.S. has the ability to vote. We have power in saying. But the problem is that unlike a for-profit company, you have competing desires by politicians within organizations. Not that there isn't politics. There's politics, but not at the same level, because in for-profit companies, they are gathered together for a certain strategy. They're all driving towards the same strategy at the end of the day. They might take some different ways to get there, but for our government, they have competing strategies. They have competing things that they're trying to accomplish. And with that, it creates a greater challenge to effectuating how you manage all the cash that you have at the federal level. So it's not as easy. It's not as clear. There's a lot of gray. It's not black and white. And so I think our politicians have a huge challenge ahead of them anytime they get elected into office to do the things that they say that they're going to do for the people that elected them. So there's a lot of negotiations that happen in the process, and the federal debt limit is no different. And so that's what we have going on right now is negotiations. And both sides are negotiating for the best interests of the people they represent, which have competing thoughts. They're not always aligned. So if you don't have alignment and you have competing thoughts, you end up with negotiations like this. And it's just a reality of the politics in the U.S. and the way the U.S. works.
Great conversation around the federal debt limit. And, we'll see. We have 8 days as the hard line, right? As Treasury Secretary Yellen has laid out. So, Paul, we're going to have to sit back and just kind of see how this thing plays out. And, a couple things that come to mind: accountability and responsibility, and let's get it done, right? So, Paul, thanks for joining me today on this episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in for this episode. If there's anything, any questions, comments, concerns, please shoot us over a note at podcast@strategictreasurer.com.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.